Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So I'm working on a more significant video right now, which is looking at the 16 areas of critical infrastructure within Western society, if you will, the United States and Canada in particular, the challenges in sustaining those sectors post-grid down. So we're talking things like energy, transportation, waterworks, the electric grid, you name it. That video is coming, so stay tuned. But today I want to talk about something which I haven't really talked about in much depth on this channel before. I have brought it up in several other videos. One of the videos was the After the Collapse installment of Dangerous People. Now the statistics I'm going to be referencing are based on the United States population, so they may only be partly relevant to your country. But generally this is the trend in psychiatry the world over, which is one that's just moving towards psychiatrists' primary role being that of prescribing medication. Now this video is not going to be an anti-psychiatry rant. That would be very easy, and there's many videos out there on that. I don't need to do that. What I want to talk about is the withdrawal effects of all of these medications that are not going to be available after a grid down situation, when you have approximately 1 in 6 people who are currently on psychiatric medications. That's not talking about all of prescription drugs, which I believe it's about 7 out of 10 people in the United States is prescribed some type of drug. Not all of those drugs are required for life-sustaining purposes, but many of them are, and life would certainly become very uncomfortable without it. Now just imagine that in a long-term grid down scenario, 1 out of 6 people that you come across has potentially run out of their psychiatric medication. Women are going to be twice as likely as men to be on these forms of psychiatric medication. I would venture to say that a good chunk of these people are probably going to be alright if they can make it through the initial phases of collapse. But there's going to be a lot of sad, mad, manic, unpredictable individuals walking the streets when the grid goes down for a prolonged period of time. This is going to lead to a lot of altercations. It's going to lead to a lot of backstabbing and deception, acts of cowardice, narcissists seeking to exploit other people for their own benefit. Sexual predators won't have the medications that they're administered that are geared towards lowering their sex drive. And of course, all the latent sleeper psychopaths and sociopaths within society will have their golden hour. This is not even counting the 10% of people who struggle with addictions to narcotics and alcohol. Of course, there's going to be a lot of overlap between them and the people who have mental health issues and take mental health medications. They are just self-medicating in a way which is illegal. Now, I want to say something about the numbers here. Now, the question as to why there are so many people taking psychiatric medications nowadays is anybody's guess. My guess would be that right now we're living in a world which is very unnatural compared to the one we've lived in for the last 100,000 years. And thus, a lot of people are not coping too well with the new current living arrangement that we have in Western society. For a variety of reasons, I'm not going to go into a big long-winded cultural critique here, but generally speaking, I am of the belief that it's no measure of health to be well adapted to a sick society. So you can use your imagination to understand how psychiatric medication fits into my worldview here. Now, I think it's been very understated in the preparedness community just how much of a problem this is going to be when people are no longer able to get these forms of medication. I've talked before about how we live in an instant gratification, I want it now or else I'm going to pout and cry society. Everybody wants a quick fix for long-term problems. And unfortunately, those things never work out. It's typically a band-aid. These medications are overprescribed by physicians, people with no psychiatric background. The psychiatric classifications are very vague. I'm not saying that people don't necessarily need them, however, because I do think that there are disorderly aspects to our behavior nowadays, which is mostly owed, once again, to the unnatural living arrangement we find ourselves in. But a very simple way to understand what the withdrawal effect of any drug is going to be. So you take the effect that a drug is having on a person, because not all drugs affect everybody in the same way, depending on your biological dispositions, your mental health disposition. It's going to change from person to person. If I was to prescribe you Adderall, which was a stimulant, you may respond differently to that medication than somebody else. Thus, your withdrawal is going to be different. Generally speaking, the withdrawal is the opposite of the effect of the drug. So if you're taking a drug to mask your anxiety, once that drug is gone, your anxiety is likely going to be much worse, at least for the short term, until you've passed the acute withdrawal phase and you begin to normalize once again. So there's 5 general classes of psychiatric medications, and for the most part, all of these, if you reverse the effect of the drug, that's what's going to happen when people are in withdrawal. So you're going to have 17% of people who already struggle to cope with the realities of life, even when those realities of life are fairly good compared to other people around the world, which some might argue is what causes the problem in the first place, is that we do have it a little bit too easy and we take it for granted. But just imagine now that those 17% of people who struggled to cope when things were good are now going to have their symptoms magnified in an even more stressful environment. So because a lot of these drugs only mask the symptoms, they don't actually cure the underlying beliefs, attitudes, and thoughts that drive these symptoms. So if you're just immediately taken off the drug, those effects are going to be far worse. So if a person is taking anti-anxiety medication for many, many years on end, masking their anxiety, and perhaps even building up a tolerance and having to gradually go up in dose, then for them to abruptly come off that medication, their anxiety is going to be much higher than it was before they started taking that medication. In addition to that, there's going to be far more for them to be anxious about, because now that pampered, sterile society that they were used to has now been turned into an anarchic, without rule of law scenario when they are forced to fully fend for themselves. Now, the 5 main classifications of psychiatric medications are stimulants, antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and mood stabilizers. So withdrawal from people who are coming off stimulants, you're going to have a lot of hyperactive people out there doing very hyperactive things. People who lack anti-anxiety medication, their anxiety is going to be through the roof. They're going to be making a lot of rash decisions, in the moment decisions, which are probably not going to be good. People who are coming off antidepressants are going to become incredibly suicidal. People who are coming off antipsychotics, well, they're going to become quite psychotic. And people who are coming off mood stabilizers like lamotrigine, which is commonly prescribed for things like bipolar disorder, they're just going to be all over the place. So the point of this video isn't to shame people who are on psychiatric medications. It's just to remind you of the importance of being aware of the fact that if those medications can no longer be produced, you're going to have a hell of a time coming to terms with whatever situation befalls us. In North America, there are approximately 50 million people who are dependent on psychiatric medication. And if they cannot sustain that medication regimen, they're going to become highly emotionally volatile and in some cases quite psychotic. The effects of this many people abruptly not taking their medication, even if we proportionately scale it down to a regional level, not only would this substantial fraction of the North American population be coping with the major 100-fold downgrade in standard of living that would accompany a full-blown grid-down SHTF scenario, they're also going to be psychologically functioning at about 10% of what they would. They're also going to be struggling from the withdrawal effects of not having these medications, which is going to have very serious consequences. And because the numbers are so vast, chances are there are several people in your family on psychiatric medication. For this reason, grid down in North America is going to be much different than grid down in other places of the world where the proportion of the population on these medications is far, far lower. This is just one more in a variety of reasons why North American grid down would be the most chaotic in the world, especially when it's one of the most heavily armed in the world. Now, some of you might be asking, Nate, what is your proposed solution for dealing with all these mental health conditions? Well, certain mental health conditions, like schizophrenia, cannot be treated in any other way asides medications. And an unfortunate reality is that some of those people may not make it. As for the other people who are characterized by the more vague diagnoses in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, which is the psychiatrist's Bible, and rightly called Bible because by and large is quite theoretical. It's not a hard science. It's based on expert consensus primarily, some of it substantiated by neurological research. But by and large, it's very debatable whether or not any of these disorders even really truly exist, or whether they're just normal aberrations resulting from our being jam-packed into these urban environments, plucked from the land and put into the asphalt matrix. The solution then, and this is not medical advice, this is just my personal opinion, is that you should try every possible alternative method to cope with your anxiety, to cope with your depression, to cope with your hyperactivity, and to cope with your supposed bipolar diagnosis or your personality disorder. Most of these, in many cases, are often misdiagnosed because most people don't spend enough time with their psychiatrists to be adequately assessed. The reality is, psychiatrists are very pressed for time. They have to see sometimes 20 to 30 people a day, and they don't have time to sit there and put you on a couch and do deep psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapy. But I would strongly encourage you to look into those things, and you need to honestly ask yourself, what part of your problem is just a natural grieving process or just a natural challenge of the current world that we're living in, that in a moment of impulsivity, vulnerability, and weakness, you did not want to confront head on. And instead you chose the route of medication to help you cope, or in many cases, like most people do, simply mask the pangs of a natural grieving process which is inherent to all life on Earth. Depression, hyperactivity, anxiety, and even mild psychosis to some extent, these are the things that make us human. To anesthetize every deviation that defines us as human beings is essentially to make ourselves into obedient cyborgs. You see, the more complex society gets, the more self-regulated we need to be in order to fit into that society. It is very difficult for people to adjust to the complicated and sophisticated world that we live in today. But adaptation is the key to survival. If you are first resorting on these medications without doing anything else for yourself, you are not in an adaptive mindset. Instead of adapting your own personality, attitude, emotions, and thoughts to the environment that you face, to the challenges that you face, you instead try to modify your brain chemistry to cope with that environment. Adaptation is the key to survival. And if you are not adapting now, you are going to have a very hard time adapting when the grid goes down. The only saving grace here for some people, and I do believe that many people are struggling with these mental health conditions, if you even want to call them that, these deviations from the norm, because they're so far removed from nature. So perhaps being thrust back into nature may actually awaken some of these people, if they can make it through the rough, acute withdrawal phase, where they're going to be going through absolute hell in a situation which is already hell. Let me know what your thoughts are below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for the upcoming video, which explores how the 16 areas of critical infrastructure as outlined by the Department of Homeland Security are going to be impacted in a long-term grid down scenario. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugoutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.